Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Gullery. Even though I'm not there today, I figure I might as well let us begin our next unit, and so I just recorded myself for this next presentation. For our next unit, we are going to be focusing on mark-making techniques. This means that basically what we're doing, if I can go to the next slide, is that we are using our pen. We're going to be using our thin Sharpie fine tip pen that I gave you guys at the beginning of the school year. You'll be using that to create different marks in order to have different values being seen so that we can create a image, right? So with our pencils, easily with our graphite pencils, we can shade, we can smudge, we can blend, we can do all those things. We can switch the pencils, right? So that we have lights and darks, exactly what you're trying to create. But if we're using like a Sharpie pen, we cannot just smudge it and make the different values that we want. We also don't have pens with different different values or like a grayscale set of pens, right? So what we have to do is create marks, right? You can see how this area over here is darker than like over here, right? We create a certain amount of marks to make an area seem lighter or seem darker. So go ahead and write down this definition. Maybe the sub can sort of just pause it whenever I'm doing these so I don't have to make my video too short, but write down this definition in your sketchbooks. Mark making is a term used to describe different lines, patterns, textures we create in a piece of art. So yeah, if the sub wants to just pause it on these definitions or anything that I say to write down, you could, but I'm just going to go ahead and move on now. So here's some examples, of course, of different mark making, and I'm just moving on quick. Go ahead and write down these different reasons of why we want to use different mark making techniques as well. It's great because it gives us the ability to create values with mediums that don't blend. That's exactly what I just talked about, right? Things that don't blend, like pens or markers, right? It gives obvious texture. Of course, we can create something to look more sharp or more rough or more smooth or fuzzy using mark-making techniques. It also looks handmade instead of having some direct replication. Many artists use mark-making techniques to make it look more like it was handmade. And it also gives, this last bullet point here, more emotion, more movement, which I think goes along with making something handmade. Instead of something looking so sterile, right, it makes something look a little more interesting by having all that extra texture and mark making. We're going to be talking about an artist named Albright Durer. He was alive from 1471 to 1528. He was an artist that was considered one of the great Renaissance artists of the time, and what he created, for the most part throughout his career, was woodcuts. So all these examples you're seeing were actually originally a piece of wood that was carved into, then inked, like a roller of ink would go on top of that piece of wood with all of these cuts in it, and then you would put paper or fabric on top of that woodcut, press it down, and then you would peel off that paper, and this is the design that would be created. So it's a printmaking technique. So every single one of these itty-bitty little hatches that you're seeing here, all this mark making, was all a knife cutting into a piece of wood. Imagine the amount of work going into something like this. So if you actually, I wanted to show you this example. This is her face, and look at all that detail, right? But if you look now at this next slide, there's her face right there. So the entire woodcut was this entire thing. Imagine now the amount of time and effort and months and months and months put into a work of art like this. We're not going to be doing a printmaking project. We're using pen and ink, okay? But this is the amount of detail I expect from you all as well. Of course, this is a bit different, but we'll get to that. Go ahead and write down this little bit of information about Albright Durer. He is a Renaissance artist, so German artist from that time period, 15th and 16th centuries, right? You could, from the time he was alive, you can tell he's born in the 1400s and died in the 1500s. He really was considered one of the greatest artists of all time, and not only because of the amount of detail he put in, but he was an art theorist. So what he did was really create and make possible the concepts of texture, and so make possible the concept of even printmaking and perspective. Perspective means drawing something going back in space so it looks realistic, like in 1 or 2 point perspective if you've done something like that before. As an artist, he was a painter, a draftsman. That means he was an amazing drawer and a printmaker. And he really specialized in realistic visible texture in his artwork, as you can see from that example before, right? It was all about using mark making, using the pen or using the way he was cutting into the board to make visible texture, and that's what made a piece look interesting. Go ahead and write that down, but I'm going to keep going. If you remember from our very first PowerPoint that when we talked about our elements and principles of art, we talked about texture, and I showed this example. And I'm sure a couple of you even remember the story, but I'll refresh your memory if you don't remember. There was a artist, Albright Durer, who had never seen a rhinoceros in his life, but had a friend that went to Africa, saw a rhino, came back, and described it to him, right? He said, oh, it looked rough, and it had armor, and the texture looked like this, right? It looked like sandpaper, or whatever he said. And then Albright Durer, just from the knowledge of the texture from his friend, drew and created this woodcut. And even though to us this may not seem like a very realistic rhinoceros, having never seen one or heard of one or been able to go on Google and find one, right, he was able to make this. And through the texture that he was able to recreate, that's how he made this look like an armored animal. Here's a couple more examples by Albright Durer. I just wanted you to see, the mark making being used at different directions. Hatching is lines in one direction. That's what we'll be talking about in just a moment. Stipples, little dots, thinking about the direction that the pen is going in, or in this case, the ink. Another nice up-close image of seeing all different kinds of mark making being used. Okay, the rest of this PowerPoint, I believe, you're going to write down these 4 kinds of mark making techniques: hatching, cross-hatching, stippling, and scumbling. And what I'm going to do is just explain each of these, and you're going to just write a quick definition or draw a quick image for each of those. First is hatching. Hatching is basically just lines that go in the same direction. So only going vertically, or diagonally, or horizontally, or even curved. So lines that go in the same direction, they can be long or short, they can be curved or straight. The closer the lines are to one another, the darker they will appear, right? So remember at the beginning of this PowerPoint I mentioned that's the purpose of us doing this mark making unit, right? Is being able to use something as simple as just one pen that is just one tone, it's black, right? And creating darker and lighter tones with it, right? So this one is not that the person pressed, this is not the best example, I understand that, but this image right here is not darker because it is like a darker pen. It's darker because there's just more lines, right? And this seems lighter because there's more gaps of white paper being seen between each of those lines, okay? So that's how we would create different values with mark making. So this is hatching. Here's a nice example of hatching, right? Lines that going in one direction, more making darker values, less making lighter values. Next we have cross-hatching. Cross-hatching basically uses layers of hatching, right? So hatching in different directions. In this example here, it explains that we have verticals first, then next after that we would go horizontally, then after that we would go diagonally. In my opinion, it's not too big of a deal to also go diagonally, but this is definitely the cleanest way to do cross-hatching. In my opinion, it's okay to go vertically, then horizontally, and then if you want it to be darker, you can just go vertically and horizontally again, right? So just so you're building up more and more of it. So you can see a difference here, or two different types of mark making. Hatching, lines only in one direction, more over on this right-hand side, right, because it's darker on that side. And then cross-hatching over here, right, lines going horizontally first, at least in this case they did, or maybe they went vertically first, and then they went vertically. It's not necessarily vertical, but it's going across through the cross contour of this object, right? And so it is okay for those lines to be curved, okay? Here's an example of hatching versus cross-hatching. Hopefully you can see the difference, right? All the lines going in one direction this way. They decided to do kind of small little hatches this time. Over here, we have lines going in one direction and then another direction. Cross-hatching. Something important with cross-hatching, I also want you to write down this definition. This is important for hatching and cross-hatching, I'm sorry. So when we get to the next two mark-making techniques, this is not as important. So I put this in the middle of the PowerPoint. cross contour lines are basically those curved lines that I was talking about. Cross contour lines are lines that reflect the direction of the volume of an object, right? It helps the viewer understand that it is three-dimensional. Okay, so this pepper right here, they decided to just go with straight lines in random directions, right? It still looks three-dimensional because we're getting darks and lights. It still looks shaded in nicely in that way with all the cross-hatching. But hopefully you can see the difference between this one and this one. This one uses curved hatching, and cross-hatching, lines to make the volume of this object. It makes it so that that line can go right along the edge and not look fuzzy, right? Because we can have curved lines. And then after that, we're thinking about creating more hatches and cross hatches going in the same direction in which we would see the three-dimensionality of this object, right? And we've practiced, drawing apples and pears already, so hopefully a lot of you are able to kind of see that this looks more three-dimensional and more clean than this first one over here. Cross-contour lines really are like a topographical map, right? So even without the outline, like on this right-hand side of this like fist, even without the outline being seen very much, like between the fingers, it still looks like there are fingers, right? There still is something happening that makes it look more 3D because of those cross-contour lines. Okay, next is stippling. I love stippling. It makes your hand hurt after a while because you're just like creating all these little dots on the page and you're, I don't know if it's a carpal tunnel, hopefully not, but stippling is basically just a whole bunch of small tiny dots that create value, right? So obviously the closer together those dots are, the darker the tone, the further are they from one another, the more white is showing, the lighter it looks. Smaller or larger dots make it look denser, and also makes it look kind of coarse. Makes it look, oh, that's spelled wrong. Makes it look kind of rough. I think for us, for our projects, we'll just be using the same pen, thin pen, so we don't have to think about larger and smaller, but that is stippling. Here's some examples of, Zaville value scale, how we could use stippling to make something look light or dark. Here's a beautiful example of stippling, and just the realism that it can have. Next we have scumbling. Scumbling is, you guys already know this because we use this a little bit with our graphite pencils, but they're basically small little circular scribbles. Scumbling can also kind of be more like scribbly instead of circular, so these, oftentimes artists call it just scribbling instead of scumbling, but it builds up texture to make something look a little more fuzzy. You can vary the direction to make it look more interesting rather than just the simple circular scribble if you want. Here's some nice examples of this one's a little bit more messy scumble. This one's a little bit more of the traditional circular scumble. But yeah, notice the buildup of it, right? The more there is here, the darker it seems. And you can even add color in, too. We won't be doing this with our project. We'll just be using black and white. But you can add color to bring interest to different areas as well. Okay, here's a couple examples of having all different kinds of mark making, right? Using scumbles or circles, using hatches, using cross hatches, using stipples, right? These are two examples by Van Gogh, and this is how he would work when he was creating a painting. He would first do it in mark making, so that then he would think like, oh, now I know which direction I want to use my brush when I apply the paint. A couple more examples. Go through these kind of quick. That's kind of a cool example. If you can notice the mark making being used is not hatching, cross hatching, scumbling, or stippling. It's the word bottle on this one. Over here it's the word, oh, they wrote shadow, shadow, shadow over here. This one says bowl, bowl, bowl. This one says violin. They use the word, their mark making technique was the word of the object. Stippling example, cross hatching. Just an example of using color. You can do this with other kinds of mediums as well. Okay, let's stop there for now. And then my next, no, actually I can go ahead. Next thing I'm going to do is kind of switch gears. And I'm going to have you guys look at this. Hopefully I can get this here. This is the practice you guys are going to be doing for today and tomorrow. Okay? So, sorry, it's kind of glitchy a little bit, but what you're going to be doing next